super platforms has created some concerns related to market power, competition, innovation. And this paper deals with the role both of antitrust and regulation in addressing these concerns, because our approach is the combination of different instruments to address these concerns. And what we do in this paper is we propose a new framework of policy interventions with two basic principles. The first is that the policy intervention should not reduce the value created, the value creation in the digital ecosystem in which platform operates. And but the second one, which is crucial, is that the intervention, the main function is to redistribute this value in order to achieve allocative and dynamic efficiency, and in this way increase welfare. Our approach is to combine this ex-ante regulatory framework with the efficient update of competition policy enforcement in order to achieve a better way which can address these concerns and create more dynamic, more innovative markets. The starting point is the platform themselves, and the notion of the platform is an inverted firm. I mean, we can have internal value creation by the provision of platforms' own services and products, but platforms themselves are very successful in creating also external value by matching different users in an efficient way. And by doing that, it's like delegate the production externally. And therefore, what we see is that the emergence of platforms, that they are very successful. And if we compare them with traditional firms that operate in similar industries, we see that they achieve similar market capitalization on the one hand, but they don't use so many employees to do that. So this is the external value that plays a role, and we see a new paradigm towards efficiency without requiring so much employment by the platform themselves. So, I mean, I'm not going to spend some time on the characteristics of the platform. So it's multi-sided, they match supply demand. We have economies of scale, data-driven economies of scope, network effects that they are quite important, and all the combination of these different driving forces can create an immense value as we move from the supply to the demand. What is worth mentioning is that market power in such an ecosystem can be perfectly supported by competitive equilibrium. I have access to more data, I have better algorithms, I introduce better services and products, and consumers are attracted to me instead of my competitor. So market tipping is something that we see in these markets, but also what we see is that the vertical and horizontal expansion, so vertical in going from the platform level to supply level, and created integrated structures that they are efficient and provide better products, but also horizontal expansion to closely related markets, using the insights from the one market to be more competitive, to provide better products in a closely related market. And this situation contributes to increased market power, which in turns can raise some entry barriers and can leave some competitors outside the market, but that does not necessarily incorporate anti-competitive strategies. This is something that can arise in the competitive equilibrium. Of course, when we are talking about platforms, there are well-developed theories of harm on which can raise additional barriers which are artificial based on excessive prices, inferior quality, reduced incentives to innovation, strategic function of mergers and acquisitions. And the question is what we can do about that. And what we see is that traditional antitrust tools can be in many aspects problematic in the sense that market definitions in some cases is unclear. How to apply, for example, SNP test in zero price markets, it's an open question. Market share threshold sometimes are not relevant with the theories of harm, while the requirement of a dominant position maybe allow competition policy to intervene only when it is too late. These platforms have grown and have become already super dominant in their markets. Case-by-case analysis, lengthy processes are additional considerations which lead us to believe that competition policy alone does not suffice to deal with this market power problem in the platform markets. And of course, we have the case that platforms grow organically without the anti-competitive strategies, which is difficult for competition policy to intervene in this case and deal with the market power. And political pressure, especially nowadays, has also become a variable that probably we need to pay close attention when we're discussing about competition policy cases. So in our proposal, the important role is the one of data. So users' data and its aggregation can have immense value. And the data feedback loop is enabled through machine learning techniques, and can have two different dimensions. I have access to more data means I have better information. I can design better products and services that they are tailored to my users, my consumers. On the one side, that means I attract more consumers, and that means I have access even to more data. On the other side, I can use this data to train the algorithms I use for the provisions of products and goods and services, which means I attract more users, more data, better algorithms. So this loop becomes important even if data has diminishing returns to scale. We don't claim that in all the applications we have increasing returns to scale. And therefore, using this paradigm, we can evaluate proposals. And proposals have, for example, related to the platform breakup. Consider, for example, a platform that it is at point A, had accumulated data, has created a large value to the ecosystem, and we break up, so we have two platforms that they are at point B instead. So clearly this solution means loss of value, which can be detrimental in terms of welfare. In a dynamic sense, it may be the case that one of the platforms located at B will be able to gain again market power, and therefore we arrive in the long term in the prior situation before the intervention. Another issue is, another proposal is to block access of platforms to new markets. Let's say we have a super platform at point A, and we design a regulation that blocks the access of this platform to new markets, for example. Again, we have loss of value because by entering to a new platform, a new market, by bringing the insights from all this data accumulation and the data feedback loop, this platform entering to a new market can provide better products and services to the benefit of users. So what do we do? How we should address this problem? So as we said, we focus on ex-ante rules, regulation, that does not decrease the value creation, but it facilitates the efficient redistribution of this value. And this is something can be done through efficient data sharing, given the important role of data. By sharing data with competitors, we have more symmetric access to data, which means that competitors can focus on the real market operations without having these obstacles related to access to data and information. And in fact, in this way, they can also have greater incentives to invest or their market operations, increasing innovation and efficiency in the market, and in this way, increasing welfare. And I mean, you can ask, of course, whether that can be something to be implemented and how. In terms of policy design, we have regulatory examples from the banking sector, the Payment Service Directive 2, the Open Banking Initiative in UK, and we can draw some lessons on how to do that. And property rights for data is an important dimension, but also technical standards are very important for making the system to work. So what we are doing in our current research as in a follow-up paper is to exactly go to the details of this policy design and how we can make it to work. Now, having this regulatory redistribution tool, then we should go back and see, having this regulation in place, what are the incentives of platforms to engage in anti-competitive strategies. And the idea here is that the firms are not, the firm boundaries are not determined exogenously, as in some proposals, but endogenously, in the sense that a platform will consider the fact that will redistribute value to its competitors when it decides to enter in a new market or to a vertical expansion. In fact, that this consideration of redistribution can lead also to reduced incentives to engage in strategies that raise artificial entry barriers. On the top of that, competition policy enforcement should be harmonically updated to fit in this regulatory framework. And on the market definition issue, probably focusing on service by service substitutability may be a promising avenue of exploration. In zero price markets specifically, that can be done by relying on massive online choice experiments. This is something that has been done by a research group like Briolson and colleagues. But we also need a periodic review of consumer online behavior to see how this substitutability is evolving over time. In another paper, we are currently working on the methodology on how we can do that in practice and how competition authorities can rely on these experiments when they assess competition policy cases. Particularly attention, of course, should be based in switching costs and data portability. Given we have a redistribution of value from platforms to their competitors, consumers should also feel free to move from one provider to another. Our paper is out there. It will be soon in an Oxford handbook. Please, comments are welcome. I see there are some questions, so let me end the show here if we have time.
Yes, certainly. So we do have time for questions. It's excellent.
So one question by Toshiaki Takigawa, I'm sorry, I don't pronounce the name correctly probably, is, even for Facebook, do we consider any breakup as a bad idea? Look, I mean, Facebook especially is a platform that we have direct network effects. And that can create value when you have many users on the same platform. So our approach here is, let's say, to consider how we can redistribute value from Facebook to other platforms so that we have an efficient Facebook with other platforms competition in the market. And also that can help us to assess merger cases like Facebook and WhatsApp. So in our proposal, in the new way of online choice experiments that has been out and we propose to assess substitutability, it may be the case that when we evaluate such a case prior to the merger, we see that WhatsApp and Facebook are highly substitutable, and therefore the element of potential competition of WhatsApp becoming a more effective competitor of Facebook becomes realistic. So our approach would be, in this case, not a breakup because we lose value, but assessing in a better way the growth of platforms and the potential competition so that we have a more effective competition between platforms in the future. We didn't see that in the case of Facebook, WhatsApp, but we can apply it in the future.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm seeing if I see it correctly, Mr. or Ms. Takigawa has another question. Then we have two questions from Konstantinos Stylianou and Anush Ganesh. So we'll try to answer them, and may I kindly ask for concise answers because we have a bit more time than for a couple of more questions. So maybe Konstantinos, would you want to go first? You were first in line.
I just got a call. I need to pick up a parcel. Can I go second or third? I'll be on the line. They just rang me. Thank you.
Okay. So we take somebody. This is live intermingling with competition law. So we take Anush Ganesh first, maybe. Anush. Doesn't seem to be with us anymore.
The question is, do you propose any action against online platforms before they become dominant? So
right.
Exactly. So that is the problem of competition policy, that they rely on dominance. So what we propose, the regulation we propose apply to all platforms, no matter if they are dominant or not, this data sharing. But of course, that will be more valuable to the platforms that they have access to small portion of data. So it will be less valuable to platforms that they have access to data. So the regulation we propose can be, is relevant beyond dominance and irrelevant to dominance, but it will help firms that compete with the dominant platforms to become more effective competitors.
Okay, thank you. So it's 12:19. Maybe one more question. Georgios, do you want to select? We have another one from Toshiaki Takigawa. Even for Facebook, do you consider any breakup is a bad idea? And then we have the question, where was it? Then we have your thoughts on the new competition tool. That might be an interesting one because I think we were all quite fascinated by Commissioner Vestager's speech yesterday. Would you want to elaborate on that one?
Yes, I mean, I don't claim that I have a clear idea on the exact workings of the new competition tool, but I would say that the new competition tool should be rely on a methodology in which help us to assess probably potential evolution of markets, a more dynamic view of the markets, how we are able to assess competition in a dynamic way. And we feel that relying on a periodic review of online consumer behavior can be very helpful in assessing how the substitutability of different platforms as they expand to new markets evolves. And that can bring us a helpful, let's say, tool to assess competition in a dynamic sense.
Okay, thank you, very interesting. So I think, although there are a couple of more questions, maybe there will be the opportunity to answer them via the chat after the session, but I think we should switch to the next presentation, right, Philip? Because we should be doing roughly like 3 an hour. Otherwise, we run out of time in the end. And so I'd ask Inge Graf to give us your presentation. I'm very much looking forward to that. And thank you to Georgios for this tremendous, very interesting start of today's session.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So my presentation and my paper focuses on differentiated treatment in platform to business relations. And what I mean with differentiated treatment here is basically practices of discrimination where a platform applies dissimilar conditions to equivalent transactions. So basically following the definition that we have in Article 102 sub C of the treaty. And if we look back to the past years and also the past month, we've actually seen quite a number of competition investigations that can be related to this broader notion of differentiated treatment. So the Google shopping case, of course, is a good example where Google was promoting its own Google shopping service to the detriment of those of rivals. The Amazon investigation is also an example where Amazon gives itself preferential access to data while it does not share that data to the same extent with its business users. In Italy, there is also an investigation going on against Amazon. This one is focusing on Amazon is alleged to give more visibility and higher search rankings only to those sellers that also take Amazon's logistics services. And then also Apple has come under scrutiny. There is an investigation by the Dutch Competition Authority looking into how Apple is promoting its own apps over those of rivals. And of course, we've also seen last week the competition investigation that the European Commission itself opened. So what the paper aims to do is to take a step back and take the statement that even though many of these competition investigations can be related to this notion of differentiated treatment, there is actually quite some key differences between them and between the competitive harm that they cause. And in my view, these differences are important when we assess the anti-competitive nature of these practices under competition law, and in particular under the abuse of dominance provision. So the paper goes into quite some detail what could be legal tests, but since I have limited time, I will focus today in this presentation only on the typology that I came up with in the paper, where I distinguish between different types of differentiated treatment and the competitive harm that they cause. And at the end, I will look at ways forward where we can think about strengthening the protection of business users versus platforms. So let me start by giving you the typology that I came up with. So in the paper, I distinguish between 3 types of differentiated treatment: pure self-preferencing, pure secondary line differentiation, and hybrid differentiation. So let me explain to you one by one what I mean with each of these. So pure self-preferencing is probably the clearest category. Because this we have seen in the Google shopping case and also in the Amazon investigation that I referred to. So here we are dealing with a vertically integrated platform that gives more favorable treatment to its own affiliated services to the detriment of those of rivals. So here there is a clear exclusionary motive of the platform. So here the paper goes into what could be the legal test and also whether I think the reasoning of the Commission in the Google shopping case makes sense. But because of time, I will not go into this here. You can find that discussion in the paper. So let me move on to the second category, which I've called pure secondary line differentiation. And the name comes from the distinction that is often made in economic terms between primary and secondary line injury, where secondary line injury is about the harm that is caused by businesses in a downstream market. So here the key differences with a pure self-preferencing is that we are dealing with a non-vertically integrated platform here that gives more favorable treatment to one or more non-affiliated businesses over others. So here there is no exclusionary motive because the platform itself is not active in the market in which it engages in differentiation between these business customers. So there's an exploitative motive here. An example here that you can think of is how rankings operate in hotel booking platforms. So platforms like Expedia and Booking.com, they don't offer hotel accommodation themselves, but they do still differentiate between hotels in the rankings, obviously. For instance, some hotels get a better ranking if they are part of a special partnership with one of the platforms. So I should stress here that the point of the categorization and the typology is not to claim that all of these types of differentiated treatment are automatically problematic or should be banned under competition law, but it just serves as a sort of framework to determine what type of harm differentiation can cause and also what the limits of competition law are. And here a relevant precedent is the Mayo case, where in particular the Advocate General was very vocal about the fact that in such circumstances where we deal with a non-vertically integrated dominant firm, it is actually not rational for that dominant firm to differentiate downstream because it could in fact benefit from the competition between its customers. So here it seems that there is limited room for competition law to address harm from this type of behavior. But I do believe that competition law can be more proactive, especially in the very extreme cases where some businesses can really be severely harmed from certain types of differentiated treatment. But also here, the platform to business regulation is relevant. For instance, one of the requirements that it imposes on platforms is to be transparent about the main parameters that they use in order to rank businesses. But again, you can ask yourself whether this is really sufficient protection for those businesses. So then moving on to the third category, and this category I have named hybrid differentiation because it's really a hybrid between the two previous categories. So here we are dealing with a platform that differentiates among non-affiliated businesses, but it does so in order to favor its services elsewhere. And this elsewhere can either be a different market in which those non-affiliated businesses are not themselves active. So this is in fact what is happening, what seems to be happening in this Italian Amazon case, where it's about Amazon promoting its own logistics services. But this elsewhere can also be the protection of the business model of the platform as a whole, where this business model, for instance, if it's based on advertising, could be eroded due to the activities that the business is doing. So here, overall, there is an exclusionary motive because the platform is foreclosing rivals, but there is also exploitative elements because non-affiliated businesses are treated more favorably versus others. So here, a good example to make it a bit more concrete is what happened to Unlocked, sorry. So Unlocked is an app that shows advertisements to users every time they unlock their screen. And at a certain point in time, Google decided that it was planning to remove Unlocked from the Google Play Store because Unlocked was violating Google's terms and conditions, because one of these terms and conditions states that app developers should not interfere with the operation of the device. And on the one hand, you can say, well, it's to some extent legitimate for Google to be concerned about this. But on the other hand, you can also see that there might be a broader anti-competitive strategy of Google behind this, because of course, it's probably not very happy that the first thing that users see when they open their phone is an ad that is not supported by Google. So in a way, it erodes Google's advertising-based business model. So here the challenge of competition authorities to capture this type of behavior is to look beyond strictly confined relevant markets. So even if a dominant platform does not compete with a business in the same market and does not have a direct competitive relationship with it, it can still have incentives to engage in differentiation. So competition authorities should be proactive and be willing to look beyond relevant markets to also ask themselves what can be the wider overall strategy of a dominant firm. And I think this type of behavior will become more important as we see that platforms are really expanding the reach of control over the range of services that they offer. And this is something that has also been called digital ecosystems or conglomerates. So in another shorter paper for Competition Policy International that was published this week, I look into this notion of hybrid differentiation a bit more. So if you're interested, you can find it there. So then, what can we do to better protect businesses versus platforms in cases of differentiated treatment? So here the paper looks at the notion of economic dependence. And here, one thing we could do is to improve and broaden the scope of competition law. And I think there is scope for this, especially if we take a bit of a more dynamic interpretation of the as efficient competitor tests. So not only protecting competitors that are already as efficient as the dominant firm, but also competitors that could become a real challenge to the dominant firm if they are allowed to expand. So the idea is not to protect inefficient competitors, because this would be bad for consumers, but to offer more room for competitors to grow into a business that can challenge at least part of the activities of a dominant firm. So a notion here that has also been used by the Director General for Competition is not as yet efficient competitors. So the question, of course, is how can we operationalize this in practice? But I guess one approach would be to look at the structural problems in the market. And if there are such structural problems, maybe there is indeed scope to take such a more dynamic interpretation. And I guess this new competition tool could help us here. Then the paper also looks at platform-specific regulatory interventions based on some lessons that are drawn from national regimes on abuse of economic dependence. So here, the paper that was written last year in summer has been overtaken by reality a bit, which is actually a good thing, because it seems that the Digital Services Act will address part of the concerns. So as the Commissioner also mentioned in her speech, so the idea is that there will be a sort of list of do's and don'ts for certain types of practices, just like we have seen this already, for instance, in the agricultural sector. And I guess here, pure self-preferencing would be a good candidate. But I think this list of do's and don'ts should also be complemented by a sort of notion of fairness that would give regulators also some discretion to look at practices that are difficult to really clearly define. So it's difficult to put a clear name on them, but that could still be problematic. So here it's interesting that the P2B regulation actually already refers to something that could be used as a starting point for such a notion of fairness, which has been based on earlier efforts in the EU when we were trying to harmonize national contract law in the context of the draft common frame of reference. So to conclude, I think this typology could be helpful. It's not perfect, but it serves as a way to see what type of competitive harm is caused by different types of differentiated treatments. And it also helps as a way to determine where competition can be strengthened, but also where there is room for potentially new regulation, as will probably happen in the Digital Services Act. So I'll stop here. I'm happy to answer any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Inge. Really most interesting and very, very up to date. I saw that we have quite a number of questions. Would you want to select and moderate the questions you take? I think we have something like 5 minutes or so for the questions. So maybe you make a selection.
Okay, we'll just have to see, because maybe you can help by picking one, because I
yeah, sure,
trouble reading
sure.
reading all of them very quickly.
Yeah, sure. I think so. So maybe we could start with Toshiaki Takigawa, who asks, do you condemn any degree of exploitation by platforms? How do you compare exploitation with efficiency and benefit to consumers?
Yeah, so the last question is indeed a key issue. So I don't condemn any degree of exploitation. And here I think it is indeed important to strike a balance between different interests, and competition law strikes a slightly different interest than these national regimes on abuse of economic dependence do, which seem indeed more fit to address exploitation. But I think they also should not go as far as we would protect businesses where where there would be no benefit of having them for consumers. So here, indeed, the consumer, the position of consumers should also be taken into account. But I do think, especially in the platform economy, the balance, because of the structural characteristics of the market, they tilt currently too much to the position of the platform. So I think there is a need to rebalance this by protecting businesses in a better way. So I think that can be done already within competition law. But here, the Digital Services Act will also complement the competition rules by taking a slightly different objective.
Okay, thank you. Then we had an interesting discourse in the chat between Magali and Mark Patterson. So depending on where you stand with your bilateral interaction, would you want to share your discourse with us? I don't know who'd go first. Maybe Magali and then Mark, or the other way around. Not sure who would be best to start. But I think that's worthwhile to share this one. Magali, would you want to?
Mark went first and then I responded, but it's a broader question, Inge, about, I really liked your typology. I was wondering where this situation would fall, where the competitive opportunities of downstream undertakings have been damaged, which is what you see in these discussions of abusive economic dependence, but there is no exclusionary motive from the upstream company. It is just an effect of its actions rather than a motive. Where would that fall in your typology?
So if the question is, even if there is no intention of the platform to exploit or to exclude, in my view, that should not be really determinative, but the effect that it has on the business should be determinative. So if it has so if it's a vertically integrated platform, then I guess it would fall under the first category. But if it's more an exploitative case where the platform itself is not competing with the downstream business, it would fall more in the second category. But then if it's a mix of the two, then the third category would be very relevant. So it depends a lot on the specific circumstances of the case. And this was also a bit of a struggle that I had when writing the paper, because it's all a bit abstract and you need very clear examples to figure out what category fits best when. So I think it's a hard question to ask in the abstract, but to answer in the abstract, but I will read your comments in the chat and then maybe I get a better idea of it.
I'm not sure.
Inge.
I'm assuming you had more. You've looked at the Belgian discussion about it, but this was a discussion in Belgium, right? So it's why I wondered about it. Thanks.
Inge, this is Mark. My question was really your first example. You get the profits from the exclusion come from benefits to a downstream affiliated firm or affiliated market. And in the second example, the profits come from presumably payments from some sort of relationship with an independent downstream firm. And so in each case, you're getting profits in a transferred from the downstream firm to the platform. And I'm not sure why we would treat those situations differently. I guess I wonder if you could say something about that.
So I think for me, the reason to differentiate, to distinguish between the two is really because that is what you see already in existing competition cases, where seems to be much easier to capture exclusionary behavior under abuse of dominance, whereas for exploitative behavior, so your second example, there seems to be some hesitance on the part of the competition authorities to really address this. But I do see your point that indeed in the second example, there is cases where the platform can also benefit. For instance, in this hotel booking platform example, where some platforms, if they are part of such a special partnership program, they actually pay a higher commission fee to the platform. So here the platform benefits as well, and there is indeed a logical reason for the platform then to use this as a way to differentiate between businesses downstream. So I see your point that it is not always clear-cut, the categories that I came up with, but I do think it helps to distinguish a bit between the competitive harm and between sort of the way we should apply our existing competition rules to these types of behavior.
Yeah, in the US, we have a somewhat different line, I guess, at least in tying cases, that I'm not sure I've ever seen in European tying cases, in that if the tying seller has a financial interest in some independent downstream firm that sells the tied product, then we treat that as an anti-competitive tie, as we would if the tied product were sold by the seller. But if there's no financial interest, then we don't treat it that way. So it's drawing a line between financial interest and none, rather than between affiliated firms and non-affiliated firms.
Okay, yeah. No, that's an interesting point.
Very interesting. Also, the comparative part of it here. So I unfortunately, I think we have to move on. There is only one. I spotted one question by Ben, also going to the intent and motive point. Ben, so, and that matches with what we have been discussing right now. So Ben, do you think your question has been covered? Otherwise, I would take this in the same thread as the last question on Inge's paper before we move on. Ben?
Hi, sure, we can move on. Maybe it can come back later.
Okay, so I think the chat will be very busy after this session. So very good. So let's go on to the next presentation. That would be Friso and Daniel. Friso, do you have a stable internet connection now? Is that working fine now?
I hope so. It's been working for the past hour or so. So let's see.
Okay, excellent. Then we thank Inge for now and go to the next presentation.
Okay, I hope everyone can see the screen. Now, my name is Friso Bostun, and together with Daniel Mandrescu, we've written a paper on app stores, and the timing of it was quite fortuitous now that the Commission has just opened 2 investigations, one into Apple's App Store, the other one into Apple Pay, one of the apps available within its App Store and operating system. And we'll definitely discuss those investigations, but let's start perhaps with a general look at the dynamics of app stores. At least in Europe, we can say there's basically only 2 significant app stores, Apple's App Store and Google Play. Together, they hold a market share of over 90%. So it sort of looks like a duopoly, but one may wonder whether we're not actually looking at a monopoly, because these app stores are integrated within mobile operating systems, which are in turn integrated into mobile devices. So you could look at app stores and see something of an aftermarket of an aftermarket almost. And within their ecosystems, at the very least, these app stores hold a monopoly or near monopoly. Even then, there are some important differences between the 2 ecosystems. As you can see, Apple is more integrated along the complete value chain, which also has the effect that within Android, there are a couple more opportunities to get apps outside of the Play Store. Within Apple, on the other hand, this is more restricted. So let's take a closer look at that. Say you're the developer of a parental control app, Custodio. It's the kind of app that allows parents to control how much their kids are using TikTok. And you get expelled from the App Store. This is based on true events, of course. Allegedly, the ban was based on the fact that Apple was competing in this very market with its own app Screen Time. Do you have any alternatives? Where can you go? Could you, for example, sideload your app directly onto the operating system? This is not possible in contrast to Android. Could you go through another app store, let's say Aptoid? Again, possible within Android, at least theoretically, but not very much in iOS. Sort of last option would be to have your app pre-installed by the device maker, but of course the device maker here is again Apple, and they do not allow for this. So the options are quite limited. And while this word gatekeeper is sometimes thrown around too liberally, I think perhaps the App Store may just qualify as a veritable gatekeeper. There are simply not many or not even any alternatives. Now, let's take a look at the various forms of abuse, the theories of harms that may be applicable in this App Store scenario. And first, let's imagine a scenario similar to the one I've just been discussing. An app wants to get on the App Store, in this case, Samsung Pay, a mobile payment app. Now, it became clear within the ACM's market study that Samsung Pay was, at least alleges, it was not allowed on the App Store, of course, supposedly because it competes with Apple Pay in that market. Could a theory of harm here be the refusal to supply theory or the essential facilities doctrine? The question would then be whether app stores can, at least for certain apps, be indispensable to compete in their markets, whether a ban or refusal from an app store would eliminate effective competition. And for some apps, we argue in our paper that this might be the case. Take a mobile payment app. Of course, it's difficult to facilitate mobile payments if you cannot have a mobile app available within Apple's ecosystem. So there may indeed be a case here. Of course, for other apps, this will be less true. However, even if Samsung Pay would then get on the App Store and thus on iOS, it would face a second issue, namely that it would not have access to the near-field communication functionality. It's the functionality that allows you to tap your phone on a payment terminal and pay, sort of the primary purpose of these mobile payment apps, because Apple reserves this functionality for itself. And this is something that is mentioned explicitly in the Commission press release on a recent Apple Pay investigation. And the same questions apply here. Is it indispensable? Would it eliminate effective competition? But it's also time for an important caveat. There may just be, well, a prima facie abuse here, but there may also be a justification. And we think those should be taken seriously in mobile ecosystems, perhaps more seriously than they sometimes are at present. And one important category of justifications relates to security. Because, for example, Google has allowed other apps to access its near-field communication functionality, and this has been linked to security concerns, allowing other people with perhaps less good intentions to allow access to this ecosystem and infringe on the security. So it'll, of course, will have to be a balance, the degree of anti-competitive effects versus the strength of this justification, which would require a case-by-case analysis, but it's important to keep in mind nevertheless. Now, a second form of abuse, which happens to relate to a second Commission investigation, namely of Spotify. The Spotify investigation, as I'll call it, well, relates to complaints that basically Apple makes it impossible for Spotify to compete with Apple Music because of the high commission fee of 30%, at least for this first year. And a framework that I find useful and potentially applicable here is that of margin squeeze. Margin squeeze is the abuse that occurs when a dominant upstream operator, in this case the App Store, forces a downstream competitor off the market by squeezing the profit margins. And this constitutes an abuse when, firstly, this downstream operator is as efficient. You apply this as efficient competitor test. Is Spotify as efficient as Apple Music? Well, it's looking at least one important benchmark, say the gross margins of each service. Spotify could make a case that it is as efficient. The quality of Spotify also seems at least comparable to Apple Music. Secondly, this conduct has to be capable of having anti-competitive effects, and this can be proven, for example, by showing that the pricing policy makes it more difficult for these as efficient competitors to trade profitably on the downstream markets. And profitability is certainly a challenge for Spotify that is not exactly made easier by this pricing policy of the App Store. What I find interesting in margin squeeze theory is not only the abuse, but perhaps especially the remedy, because it's quite clear if a margin squeeze is found, the dominant upstream firm has to adapt its price up to a level that its own downstream operation could trade profitably. And if you look at these gross margins of Apple Music at current, such a commission fee for Apple would be more in the 15% range rather than 30% range. So that's a benefit, I think, of looking at margin squeeze here. Now, one final abuse that I'll discuss before handing it on to my co-author is leveraging. Leveraging, at least since Google Shopping, is defined as a conduct consisting in use of dominant position on one market to extend that position into another market. Now, traditionally, this was seen as more of a category of abuse that comprised several forms of abuse, such as refusals, squeezes I've just been discussing, but also tying, discrimination. In Google Shopping, it seems to be elevated to a independent form of abuse and a well-established one even, of which the legal test means looking at, well, the conduct just defined, at least when it is capable of having or likely to have anti-competitive effects. Of course, if we're looking at this as indeed an independent form of abuse, it would apply to a variety of conduct. For example, both commission investigations could rely on it. In our paper, we look at a whole other sort of conduct, both technical self-preferencing on the one hand and contractual self-preferencing, which can be broken down into all kinds of behavior, but I won't elaborate on this too much. Of course, being the commission, you'd be careful to rely on it at least before general court has made its judgment in the appeal of Google Shopping. And in the hearing report, you can already see that whether leveraging is indeed an independent form of abuse or will be accepted as such is a big point of contention. But secondly, more normatively, you could wonder whether leveraging as an independent form of abuse is really the best way here. Would a more tailored self-preferencing abuse not fit better? Would perhaps it be an idea to dust off this discrimination abuse of Article 102C? But that would take me too far. Instead, I'll hand it over to my co-author, Daniel.
Thank you, Friso. I hope everyone can hear me. So something we also wanted to discuss in our paper is, of course, a potential abuse which has come up quite a lot, gained a lot of popularity in the recent publications and news online, and that's the App Store tax. Basically, the commission that app providers have to pay Apple when they offer a paid app on their App Store. And we all know the story. It's basically these 30% commission, which is levied based on the price of the app or the price of the subscription, which then may even go down a bit, but it still remains relatively high. Now, if you consider this price structure of the platform, of the App Store, where some apps have to pay a financial fee in order to distribute their apps through the App Store, whereas other ones don't, you can say from a platform perspective, this makes sense because the platform owner, Apple, has to make sure it attracts multiple types of actors to the platform, including consumers, to make it attractive to everyone. in order to make sure they all find a way to make a transaction with each other. Now, making this compromise between various interests in the platform environment eventually ends up with making different offers for different parties, ends up in skewed pricing. Basically, someone pays more than the other one, meaning that one group of customers would evidently, at least partly or fully, subsidize a different customer group of the platform. So from a platform perspective, this makes sense. But when you look a bit closer to this outcome, and you try to look at it through the lens of Article 102 and the idea of excessive pricing, this outcome may also, it can be argued that the outcome is a results in excessive pricing for the apps that are actually paying for their distribution through the App Store. And in the context of Article 102, the idea of excessive pricing is a price is excessive when it bears no more and has no more relation between the value provided and the price that is being demanded. Now, the value that's being provided by an app store to an app developer is you're providing them with the tools how to build an app. You're giving them guidance on how it should look like based on your knowledge of consumer preference, of how Apple knows that iOS users love their apps. And of course, it gives them access to wide market, technical support, etc., etc. However, when you look at the pricing structure, this additional value, of course, is also provided for non-paying apps. They also get this. But they don't have to contribute that 30% commission because they're free, or they provide goods outside of the App Store. So, but of course, this service is nothing is created for free. So this service is also financed by the paid apps. The question is, in the context of excessive pricing, can we really say that the presence of these non-paid apps, of these free apps or apps that provide services outside the App Store, outside the mobile phone ecosystem, is that part of the value that the paid apps are willing to pay for? Is that something that they consider worthwhile coming to the App Store for? Or is it something they simply cannot avoid? Because the App Store is the gatekeeper and Apple determines the terms. Now, part of the presence of these non-paid apps will evidently have value also for the paid apps, because the non-paid apps, the free ones, they also bring along quite a lot of consumers, which may in turn also purchase paid apps. So there is value to that presence. The question is whether that value should be fully compensated by the paid apps, if it's not fully gained by them. So it's a bit of it's more of a question than a solution with regard to this potential abuse. And then, Friso, you can move to the next slide. The other thing we were considering in our paper was, again, the iOS governance, the structure, the way everything works for app developers when it comes to offering their apps on iOS, which is always has to be through the App Store. There's no way around it, regardless of the type of the app you're developing. However, when you are developing an app which provides goods or services outside of the app, you use the App Store, but you have to use your own billing solution, your own payment system, whichever you choose from the ones that are out there in the market, and there are quite a few. But if you have a paid app which you're planning on selling through the App Store, or you're planning on selling a subscription through the App Store, then you have to use Apple's in-app purchasing system. And the reason for it is evidently so that Apple can lift this can charge its commission of 30% or less. Now, if you take this combination of the App Store and the in-app payment system, you can also consider this form of tying. So if you want to offer an app, you have to do it via the App Store, and you have to use the in-app payment system. And they're all separate products. I mean, there you have an operating system, a distribution channel, and a payment solution. And they all have, there is, if we're talking in the context of Article 2, there is evidence of demand for these tied products. So even in the case of the App Store, and where Apple doesn't allow the existence of parallel app stores, if you jailbreak your phone, you will find iOS compatible app stores, which are pirate according to Apple, but they're nonetheless, it's evidence that both users and app developers would like to have something separate. So there is, and the same can be said for the in-app paid solutions. There are many of them, they're developed and currently used by apps that basically provide real-world services. So the difficulty here is comes down, if this is the way pursued, will be down to the question whether the iOS and the Android ecosystems will be seen as separate markets. If these will be seen as separate markets, then finding a dominant position on part of Apple with regard to this entire situation would be very easy. If that's not the case, it will complex the situation, because then it becomes a discussion of who's the bigger player in the app market. But looking at the ACM's recent study in the market for app stores, there are quite some convincing arguments for why app developers would consider iOS and Android as separate markets, which they need to access both rather than substitutes. In this context, so if you perceive this as a tying case, the foreclosure effect, the competitive concerns of this tie, they're quite evident. By not allowing the parallel existence of another app store for iOS, evidently there's absolutely no competition with respect to app stores. And competition on the iOS app market is also primarily in the hands of Apple, basically. If something is, according to Apple, not in accordance with its terms and conditions, then that's pretty much the end of the story. That's not to say that everything is bad and Apple is evil. There are many efficiencies to this practice. It's not for nothing that users still are very much willing to pay a lot of money for Apple products, for the iPhone. They're also statistically shown to pay a lot more for their apps. They're willing to pay more. Whether that's a will or something that they're forced into is a different story. But there's many quality efficiencies that have been achieved through this combination. So at the end of the analysis, you might come out with the result, yes, there is a detrimental effect to competition, but the efficiencies created by Apple are actually, let's say, worthwhile. To the final point, if these efficiencies are not convincing, and you take into account all the other potential abuses which have been discussed by Friso himself, they all stem basically from this tie, from tying the App Store to the iOS. So if you want to resolve everything, or at least a lot of it, a very perhaps brutal solution would be to untie the App Store from iOS. And that doesn't mean necessarily that Apple would not allow to pre-install it, but simply it should allow the let's say, parallel existence of other app stores for iOS. in such cases, app developers, if they're unpleased with the App Store, they can just turn to other options, which are now not available. A less, let's say, harsh approach to this would be forcing Apple to be more transparent in terms of the apps that they allow or not allow, the reasons why they exclude apps from their App Store, have a better management of the complaints that come from app developers, be a bit more fair in a sense to the concerns of app developers, and also from a technical perspective, allow the existence of at least, if not a parallel app store, the possibility of having web apps, which to certain degrees can serve as a substitute for for installed apps on iOS. So thank you very much for your attention. Hopefully it was not too much information in one go. And we're always open for questions.
Thank you. It was very much information, but very interesting one as well. So I think that's fine. Would you want to take questions yourselves? Otherwise, I mean, in any case, I think we have a discourse or a double question by Giorgio and Ben. So maybe we could take that one first, and then can take it from there. Daniel Frieso, is that okay for you?
Yeah, absolutely. I can maybe start with that double question, and Daniel can take the next one.
Fine.
So yeah, they're both on objective justification. First of all, this fit within the scope of Article 102. Security is a bit of a difficult fit if you look purely at the case law of the Court of Justice. There's the Hilty case, for example, where they said, well, I mean, it's not for you to decide which nails are safe to be used with your nail guns, especially not if those nails are only your own nails. So in that sense, security was sort of dismissed. But then again, I think we need to not only update the theories of abuse, the theories of harm, but also our view of justifications, which is a bit of an underdeveloped area. In that sense, Ben's question comes in. Well, first of all, I think in mobile ecosystems, security is indeed a huge efficiency. Just like the safety which you can use Apple products does not only concern security in the traditional Hilty nail gun kind of way, but it just makes the complete ecosystem a lot more valuable, a lot more user-friendly, and in that sense can be not only an objective necessity justification, but also simply an efficiency benefit justification. So that would be one way to update our understanding without running against precedent too much. I hope that has sort of answered those questions, and perhaps Daniel can take one of the next ones.
Yeah, I'm just I'm reading the the chat. I'm just not sure what's the next question. Actually, it's more of a remark. So I see here that the Commission is pursuing a constructive refusal to supply a theory of harm in the Spotify case. I can imagine that would also be an interesting angle to approach. I think we didn't pursue this simply because I'm not very familiar with this case, so I can't say I've come across something major of constructive refusal to supply. Yeah, in a way which we could apply it to this situation, and also, yeah, because the main concerns are of Spotify seem to be very much fixated on the fee that they're paying, and basically to get rid of it, they're not very much. Don't seem inclined to a reduction of the fee, but simply to its elimination. So, yeah, but fair point to look at it. We'll definitely consider it. Yeah.
Are there any other questions we've missed? Toshiaki asked whether the App Store charge of 30% seems too high, but can we define a proper level of charge?
Yeah, that's the height of the level, the height of the commission. That's I'm not entirely sure. That's for the competition law authority to intervene in. What you can intervene in is whether the way it is being priced is distributed across these customer groups of the platform in a way that is not, let's say, detrimental to competition, and it's not a form of exploitation. Whether that means that reducing it to 29% for the paid apps and 1% for the free apps, perhaps that's enough. But it's more about, it's unreasonable in the sense that one group pays everything and the other one doesn't pay anything, while they both get exactly the same value or similar value, at least, from the App Store.
And if we at least have some time left, I can perhaps take the last question on the Hay case. Also more of a comment, it seems, but yeah, it was after Spotify, that was the next big App Store complainant, although it didn't develop in the case. What it did result in is Apple making changes. Now, app developers will not only be allowed to sort of debate the merits of their own case with Apple, but also the merits of the App Store rules. And that, at least if taken seriously by Apple, could bring about some major changes, or at least discussions on those changes and perhaps ways forward. So it'll be interesting to see if Apple is serious about having app developers debate the merits of those App Store guidelines.
All right, so I think, so Todd Davis, yeah, but we had one. I think we have answered the question that popped up so far. So I'd suggest we move right on to the next presentation. We are still on schedule, more or less, which is very interesting. And thank you for that very, very nice double presentation, Friso and Daniel. I found it most interesting, very thought-inspiring. And we now go to Dirk and Jeffrey's presentation. If I understand correctly, Jeffrey is middle of the night, so maybe a bit tough. And Dirk, you are going to present. So please go ahead.
Okay, great. So I'd like to talk to you about two things today. The first is about the world of online retail, which is why I'm now sitting in an online retail warehouse to make my presentation. And the second part of the presentation is going to be, well, how do the features of the world of online retail, how do they relate to competition enforcement regarding MFN? And also how it relates to a paper that we're co-authoring with Jeff about competition policy regarding MFNs. Okay, I'm going to share my presentation. Great. So I'd like to start by talking about just three sort of important features of online retail. The first is, I think it's uncontroversial to say, it's a very innovation-heavy sector. It's moving fast, and there's a lot of business model innovation to try and find what is the best way to sell goods to consumers online. A second important feature is visibility, where both brands and platforms find it crucial to be visible to users. And so there's a ubiquity of two-sided markets with feedback loops, where brands can turn to platforms to boost their visibility, but platforms also need to acquire strong brands to attract consumers. And finally, a third feature, which I'll talk about, is that there are multiple distribution channels. So one important decision for brands is going to be to decide which channels to distribute through. So on innovation, maybe we can take a simple example, which is, imagine that I want to buy some running shoes online, okay, but the same reasoning could be applied to apps, to hotel, or to insurance. There are many places that I could turn to do so. I could go to Amazon or Zalando, or even Google, or the direct channels. So I could go to Adidas, to Nike. And in making this choice, price competition is certainly going to be a factor, but it's not going to be the only factor that dictates my product choice. Differentiation and innovation is going to be key here. So for example, if we look at the in-store experiences of these platforms, you'll see that there's a lot of differentiation in terms of creating user-friendly GUIs, giving users targeted recommendations, maybe investing in certain brands, investing in reviews, or developing virtual assistant ordering or virtual try-on. Similarly, there is also innovation going on in after-sales services, notably return policies. For example, if you order on Zalando, your package comes in a return-ready package. So you don't need to print a label anymore. You just drop off your package at the post office, or if you're not happy with it. So I guess the upshot is, there's a lot of, in this space, the winning paradigm hasn't yet been found. And firms are competing on price, but they're also competing to try and find that paradigm. Just a couple of examples. If you compare the online interface of Amazon and Zalando, you see very different philosophies about how to sell a good online. So on Amazon, there's a lot of information. It will tell you what's the best seller, which shoe does Amazon recommend for you, and there's sponsored brands. If you go to Zalando, it's very different. It's just trying to put the products in front of you with very minimal information. It's not clear which of those is the best strategy. Firms are trying to find that out. And then an alternative, if you look then to Google, you see still other philosophies about how to sell goods online. So a brand could decide that the best option is to invest in ads on Google and try and attract users to the direct channel, or maybe it thinks it has a price advantage and it just wants to place an ad to show that it's cheaper, and then you just go on the Google shopping box. Okay, so I think that's about him. That's what I think we need to remember about innovation. A second big point is about visibility and distribution channels. So if you're a retailer, what are your options to gain visibility? Well, obviously one option is to go with the online platform, but that involves a really important trade-off, which is, on the one hand, the platform can connect you with more users, but obviously in creating that user base, the platform is investing money, and at some point it's going to have to recoup that money, which means platform fees. And so as a retailer, that's a cost to you. Again, there are numerous platform business models which range from retail agency fees to just ad placement. Alternatively, as a retailer, you can just say, no, I'll go it alone and I'll sell through a direct channel. Now, the downside is that you lose access to some of the users that may be exclusive to platforms, but you earn a higher return on the users that are loyal to your product. Now, between these two wide options, there are still more alternatives. So you could, retailers do partially outsource their retail process, for example, via services such as Shopify. And of course, you still have a brick and mortar option. So I guess what do we have to remember from all of this? Inherent in this world is a free rider problem, where users are tempted to use platforms with the best interface to choose their product, but then to make their purchase decisions via direct channels or rival platforms where prices may be lower. And in turn, that may undermine investments in the platform and innovation. So that's just that's behavior that's totally plausible. But what's interesting is then how will firms react to that? And you see sort of both on the platform side and on the retail side, multiple options. So for example, one of them is steering. You could have retailers, brands who decide to steer users towards alternative platforms. That's sort of what underlies Amex and Apple Spotify, or attract users with lower prices. Conversely, you could see platforms steering users towards brands that do not undercut them in other channels. Another potential reaction would be delisting. So brands may decide not to go on a platform, and a platform may decide not to carry brands. And finally, which is what I really want to talk about today, one reaction is the most favored nation clause or other vertical restraints. So under a wide vertical most favored nation clause, a platform would say to its retailers, okay, I will sell your goods as long as you agree not to undercut my platform price on any other channel. And then you could have narrow MFNs where the platform says, okay, retailers, I'll sell your good, as long as you don't undercut the platform price on your direct channel. So then the question that Jeff and myself tried to answer in our paper is, well, these are pretty complex features of online retail and online ecosystems more generally. And the question is, well, to what extent does the competition literature on MFNs take these features into account? And to what extent does competition policy, notably decisions and legislation, to what extent do they take these features into account? So we reviewed more than 50 law and econ papers relating to MFNs. Some of them were empirical, some of them were theoretical economics, and others were normative papers. We reviewed more than 15 decisions and laws. That review is actually still in progress. So maybe I can sort of a spoiler is that overall, there is very little focus on investments, innovation, and entry. If you look at the economic literature, both the theoretical and empirical literature suggest that MFNs have highly ambiguous effects. If you look at the normative literature, by and large, most authors recommend that these clauses should be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. However, when you look then at decisional practice, you see that not always, but sometimes authorities have overstepped the mark and decided to ban MFN clauses. And this is most notably the case via legislation in the hotel sector. So maybe I'll dig a little bit deeper into that literature. So we analyzed 10 empirical papers on MFNs, and we found that none of them actually analyze innovation, investments, or entry. What those papers do often look at is price effects. Not always. Some of them look at other factors that aren't even price, but when they do look at price effects, there is only limited evidence that MFNs, be they narrow or be they wide, lead to overall higher prices. If you want to draw welfare implications from those papers, it's incredibly difficult because there's no discussion of innovation, investments, and entry. So you only have part of the picture. Then moving to the theoretical literature, again, there is more focus on prices, on investment, but those effects are very ambiguous. Looking at prices, the papers that do find that MFNs unambiguously lead to higher prices, those papers, by assumption, ignore investments, entry, and innovation. So again, I think maybe one way to summarize this is there's a lot of research, but most of it only offers a relatively incomplete picture. Given that it's no surprise that actually when you look at the normative literature, it's almost unanimous. It's unanimous basically that narrow MFNs should be analyzed on a case-by-case basis. There are some authors that believe that wide MFNs should be analyzed or should be prohibited by object. But even then, it's not entirely clear from their papers whether they think there should be some stronger presumption against wide MFNs, or whether they're really talking about the per se prohibition. As I mentioned already, then when you look to the decisional practice, it seems to be quite a bit stricter than what either the economic or the legal literature would suggest, where you see, while many authorities have stopped short of applying per se prohibitions, there are a number of commitment decisions where firms have basically agreed to remove wide MFNs. I mean, that may be, it may be valid, but because they're commitment decisions, there's usually relatively little information to go by. But then what we do see, which does seem out of step with the literature, is that many legislators have gone much further and have banned MFN clauses wide and narrow. So that seems to be a mistake. So our analysis leads us to sort of some closing thoughts. The first thing is that the law and econ literature on MFNs points towards highly ambiguous effects. A second thing is that literature focuses relatively little on investments, innovation, and the entry of competitors. And that may be because it's just easier. It's probably easier to analyze price effects than it is to analyze investments, innovation, and entry. But it seems to be sort of a missing part of the puzzle, so to speak. One problem that we can see is that when you look at some normative papers, maybe allow me to take a step back. When the theoretical literature talks about entry, investment, and innovation, as I mentioned already, it's highly ambiguous. And one intuition is that wide MFNs may deter entry by lower cost rivals. There are two problems with this. The first problem is that effect has sometimes been overplayed in subsequent papers, where authors use a shorthand and say, well, wide MFNs restrict entry. And that is simply not what the theoretical literature is saying. Subsequently, the second problem, and I think that's how we answer the question, is, well, what type of entry do we think is most likely in this digital space? Is it going to be more lower cost entry? Or is it going to be entry by differentiated business models? And that would affect where we fall about MFNs. Our paper also identifies some parameters that authorities should look at, or that the literature suggests authorities should look at when they analyze MFNs. There's sort of some are pretty self-explanatory, so they should look at competition from other distribution channels, the bargaining power between platforms and retailers, question whether consumers are loyal to brands or to platforms, which is related to the question of, well, would consumers know about the brand if the platform did not exist? And finally, are there sunk investments by the platform or by the brands that may create a risk of holdup? Another observation is, again, as I suggested, it may be a mistake to focus solely on price, because by their very nature, these clauses may lead to a higher price, but they also, at the same time, they alter the good, they alter the composition of the good. So the price may nominally be higher, but it's no longer the same good that consumers are acquiring. They're getting services with it. And finally, more broadly, free riding is really a game of cat and mouse. So whatever the platform does or ceases to do, brands and users will adapt accordingly, and vice versa. So that leads to a question which is often ignored in the literature, not always, but often. What happens when MFN clauses are removed? It doesn't mean that the platform is no longer going to try and prevent free riding. It means that it will do it differently. So we need to analyze what Demsetz would call the Nirvana fallacy and try and identify the right counterfactual, which is going to be challenging. So that's it for me. It's more, at this point, we have mostly questions and interrogations, but I hope it'll have been useful.
Okay, so thank you very much. So far, I think we have one question by Elias. Do you see that, Dirk? And would you want to address that?
Yeah, I'm reading through it now. Yeah, I mean, I'm not, it's right. It's unclear how much platforms invested in the design. It's a very open question. I'm not saying that that necessarily free riding would lead to a complete degradation of these platforms without MFNs. But I think that any authority that would want to take a decision in this space would definitely need to look at that type of data. Very much, what is Amazon investing to design its store, and how much of that could rivals free ride on? Because some of the things I mentioned, there's less of an obvious free riding motive. So if you're talking about your return policy, that's something that users can't sort of they can't undercut you on that. They can't, you can't say, well, I'll take Amazon's if you buy on Amazon, you get their return policy. If you buy elsewhere, you get their return policy. So, but then on designs, on GUI, for example, if Amazon is very good at recommending the right product for you, that is most definitely something that a rival can free ride on. So we need to look at the investments.
Okay. I will have another question by Mark Patterson.
I think it's definitely plausible. I think it's a little bit difficult because it's hard to relate. It'll be hard to relate a specific investment to a specific case. So a lot of these investments are general to the platform. It's hard to then measure how one specific instance of free riding would undermine those general platform investments. But obviously it should be part of an analysis. I think regardless of the efficiency justification for platforms, it should be something that is in competition authorities' minds for another reason, which is competition authorities at the state of a restriction of competition. They shouldn't just be asking, well, are prices going to be lower for consumers? They should be asking, well, are consumers going to get more consumer surplus? And that is intimately linked to the question of free riding. So it's not just for firms to offer a justification, it's for authorities to show that that the MFN clauses are actually leading to less consumer surplus.
Okay, right. So let's go ahead and maybe now do Daniel 2, as it were. Right. So we have to watch time. So without further ado, thank you very much, Dirk. So it's always so sad that we have to hop from one paper to the next with so little time. But Daniel, please fire ahead, and then we still have Peter and Alexandre.
Thank you. I'll do my best to be quick. So I'll back again with another story about tying, only that this one is a bit different in a sense that this paper doesn't really go into the specific behavior of a specific company. It's more about an exploration of how tying and bundling looks when it occurs in the context of online platform. And the reason for this alternative approach was that whenever I read something about tying and bundling, whether it's economics or legal articles, the tying and bundling was always a given. It was always something that was simply assumed to exist, that is easily identifiable, and then we move on to analyze it. But I have quite some doubts that this would be also the case when we're dealing with tying and bundling by online platforms. So I wanted to see how this entire process looks when dealing with these actors. And when we move on to through this process, the first step is basically look at the life cycle of the platform to understand when does tying and bundling can actually enter the picture. The first stage is the launch stage. So basically when the platform is, so to say, born, when it wants to get all its customer groups on board, and these launch phases can differ in strategies, but the aim is the same. Get everyone on board, make sure that you find a way to monetize that functionality which you're providing them, that interaction which you're creating for them, and move forward with growing. Now, the next stage would be the phase where this platform actually reaches critical mass, where it becomes viable, when it has a, let's say, relatively stable customer base, which allows it to operate profitably. And from that stage onwards, the platform will continue growing, will continue improving its functionality, creating more width and depth, basically meaning you expand the functionality. So if you're eBay, it means you have more sales listings. If you're in more countries, if you're Booking.com, you have more hotels on the platform in more regions of the world. Now, at some point, this optimization, this extension of the functionality would simply no longer be possible, no longer be profitable, or simply it's no longer interesting financially. And then this is the step where a lot of platforms would reach at some point. And at that point, you can say, well, the platform has a rather significant amount of market power at this point because it has a significant and stable customer base on all the sides of the platform it owns. So this is where we need to start worrying about whether or not tying and bundling will take place, because it is very likely, or it is at least a very attractive options for platforms to engage in these types of practices. And this is the reason for it comes in the next phase, which is the expansion stage, because if you can no longer improve what you are doing because you've maximized it, the next option is simply to expand, meaning as a platform, you either add another functionality to the platform, which you considered would be attractive to your already existing customer base, or you create another separate platform, which you consider would be attractive for your existing customer base. And then you hope that you're able as a platform to leverage that customer base from one functionality to another, from one platform to another, depending on how you expand. And this is where tying and bundling comes in, because tying and bundling would allow, or bundling would allow for this leveraging of the customer base to, let's say, be done in a very direct way without too much fuss. There's simply an obligation to use both platforms or functionalities. So the thing that can be tied and bundled depends on the expansion strategy. It's either the functionality or the platform itself. And when you look at the functionalities or platforms, if they provide only a single functionality in practice, you can see that that platforms often display either indirect network effects, which are positive with respect to one customer groups. And this is mostly the case with platforms which are supported by advertisement, meaning that they offer, for example, CNET offers product reviews for consumers, but it also has a non-search advertisement side. Users have also to share their data with third parties which buy the data from CNET, etc. So in this case, it's only the advertisers or the buyers of data which are interested in an increase in the amount of consumers that come to CNET, but not the other way around. And the second type of platforms or functionalities that you see are the ones which show that indirect network effects are positive with regard to more than one customer groups. And that's usually the case when there's this mutual matching functionalities where two customer groups are brought together to the platform in order to have a transaction with each other, for example. That's the case with hotels and consumers on Booking.com. And this can occur with or without the presence of a transaction, a monetary transaction possibility. So you'll see this kind of characteristics in the case of Booking.com, where you can make a transaction, but you'll also see it with most, let's say, price comparison websites, which only allow you to see the prices of products, but do not provide you with the possibility of actually buying them. They only direct you through a retailer. Now, these functionalities or these additional functionalities or additional platforms which are introduced, they're going to be either, they can have various commercial links, so they can be complementary, they can be weak substitutes, or they can be non-related technically. What matters, so they can come in different shapes, but what matters for, let's say, the existence of competitive concerns is how much customer overlap is there between the functionalities or the platforms. So in the case of Booking.com, when it had a hotel booking functionality, well, adding a flight search aspect to its platform evidently has a significant amount of customer overlaps, because most customers that will book a hotel abroad will also need a flight at some point. And that's also something that needs to be taken on once we move on to the legal assessment of tying in this context. So how does, now that we know what can be tied, how does tying actually look like when you're dealing with platforms? The very simple contractual form is, you'll always find in the terms of conditions of the platform, that's usually if you use this, if you use platform A, you have to use platform B, otherwise there's no way around it. And these terms of conditions may also include, may not be so much, may not so much refer to the active usage of the platforms in parallel or the functionalities in parallel, but simply introduce the obligation of sharing your data across platforms. And at some time, at some point, these contractual obligations will be, or can be in any case, followed or enforced through technical manners, which an example of which can be obliging consumers to use a specific type of sign-in account across platforms. Otherwise, it would not be possible. Now, on a more technical part of tying, what you can also expect is a lack of interoperability. When we're seeing the tying of platforms, a lack of interoperability with third-party platforms would help facilitate the tying, because it would enable, it would make multi-homing impossible for the tied product. Common sign-in accounts, the common creation of profiles across platforms. So you sign into Facebook and you get automatically also an Instagram account. I'm not saying it happens, it's just an example. This would be a form of tying, because you're basically forced into, well, not forced to, but you're planted, your profile is created on two parallel platforms, even though you may not be interested in it. The same applies, automatic launch of functionalities. You search for a hotel, you also get a search for a flight. Click-through obligation, you want to book a room. Before you book that room, you would have to go through a search of flights. The same principle applies. What does this mean for the tying and bundling framework we have under 102? Well, the difficult part starts right at the beginning, because there we are required to establish that the platforms we're dealing with, or the functionalities we're dealing with, they involve separate products. With platforms, that would usually not be the case, not be so difficult. But when you're dealing with functionalities on a platform which you consider to be tied to each other, that becomes a serious discussion, because it requires you to cut a platform into pieces, in fact, and do a market definition based on those pieces, which would trigger quite a lot of questions. But this spills over, of course, to the next step, which you have, where you have to define the relevant market, establishing dominance for the platform, for its functionality, or the platform itself. Again, very much depends on your ability to distinguish these separate products. And this difficulty is on top of the fact that these platforms, these interactions, these functionalities are two-sided, which is in itself, introduces in itself a difficulty for the market definition, because you might end up dealing with multiple markets. Now, moving on to coercion, how does coercion look like in this situation? What is the question you need to ask? In the context of coercion, basically, can you participate on a single platform, either actively or without participating on a different one? Can you simply be, as a consumer, can I be only on a single platform, or by simply creating a sign-in, an account for a platform, for a service, I'm automatically also creating a profile somewhere else for a different service, for a different platform, which I'm not interested in. But it is created nevertheless. The similar question applies to the functionality. Can I make use of functionality without triggering a different one, without having to go through a different one? And for the foreclosure effect, it's a difficult discussion, which you could, I'm not going to go into too much, but that depends on the network effects at play. In each case, the commercial relationship between the functionality or platforms that have been tied, the ease of replication. So can competitors really replicate the entire scenario quickly? Is it costly or not? And do competitors have the option of competing with negative prices, which is also an important element to having lively competition, even with bundles which are offered for free. And at the end of it, and this will be the last aspect of the discussion, when we're discussing efficiencies in the context of bundling, in the context of platforms, these should be taken more seriously, and which is currently not the case. These efficiencies in the context of Article 102 are often either ignored or simply not addressed very well. But when you think about it, platforms are inherently efficiency creating, and tying and bundling practices have a lot of potential of creating further efficiency. So it's actually a stack up of efficiencies, but in practice, we have the tendency to ignore them. And if you look at the Google Android decision, you'll see that in the 200 or 300 pages of the decision, there's almost no discussions of efficiencies, which is a shame, because the case certainly involves a lot of efficiencies, which could be interesting to discuss. So thank you for bearing with me. And if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them.
Daniel, thank you very much. First of all, I do share your efficiency remark you made at the end. That's been a shame. And I'm also quite glad that I don't get logged in so far to, I don't know what, Tinder and Facebook if I log into my LinkedIn account, because it's basically the only thing I have. But yeah, I don't know, maybe I have all those accounts already and didn't know about that. So that may also be the case. Thank you very much. So since we had a couple of questions on tying already, would it be okay for you to address other questions in the chat so that we could move on to Alexandre right away?
Certainly,
so
no problem.
Thank you very much. That's very kind. So we now would go over to Peter and Alexandre, and I'd suggest it's now 10 to 2. Technically, we would stop at 2, but we have a 15 minutes break. So I'd suggest we take, if the team Düsseldorf oversight allows for it, that we may take like 5 minutes or so from the break, if that's okay. Because as all the papers, the next one is also really very interesting. Okay, so Alexandre, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. So, so this is a paper I wrote with Peter Exiadis, who is a professor at King's College and also a lawyer here in Brussels. And I wanted to start with what Vestager said yesterday. So we have understood that the Commission is working on 3 paths to improve its digital strategy. One is to strengthen the old competition tool, in particular, she said, with more interim measure and restorative remedy. And then the 2 new ones are interesting. One is the creation of a new competition tool, which will be a kind of market investigation at the European level, and then to create a new economic regulation for large online gatekeeper platform. So what's interesting is that yesterday Vestager mentioned only one option, but in fact in the Inception impact assessment, there are 2 options. So maybe it is showing her preference, I don't know, but one is what I call a simple option, and this is what she explained yesterday, and you will have a list of black clauses, a bit like what we have, and it has been mentioned before in the directive on unfair trading practices in the food supply chain. Maybe that's a bit too simplistic for the digital world, we will have to see. Then in the Inception impact assessment, there is another option, a more sophisticated one, which is, says the Commission, tailor-made remedy, which should be decided on a case-by-case basis. And there probably we are closer to another directive, and that is the directive containing the telecom code, where you have a more sophisticated system of designation of remedy. No, that's what the Commission is thinking about. No, we wrote our paper before those proposals, but our paper are very much aligned in regarding those proposals, and this is why I have the presentation around those 2 issues. So the old competition tool and what could be done to improve it, and then a new tool, whether the new competition tool or whether a new economic regulation, or, and that was, seems again the preference of Vestager yesterday, having both. Now, regarding first the old competition tool, what we say in our paper is that we should improve first, we can do a lot already with competition law, fortunately, but maybe we have to reorient the focus of the competition authorities. And we know that the trigger for their attention, in a way, is market power. And so this is why the assessment of market power is very important. And we suggest in our paper 3, let's say, evolution with competition, with the traditional antitrust tool, because we know that we rarely know revolution in antitrust. So it's better to propose evolution. And one evolution is to focus more on this aspect of conglomerate aspect. Several papers have mentioned that during that conference. So that's one thing. You have to appreciate the market power according to the presence in different relevant markets or control of ecosystem. And here we have some element already in the existing competition law that I mentioned in italics. I will not develop here in the interest of time. The second thing is to focus much more on potential competition on existing products, so on barrier to entry, okay? Again, we have some element in several guidelines or case in EU law, it's just extending them a little bit. And then the third proposal, which is probably the newest one, is to focus on potential competition, but not on existing product, but on future products, okay? So, and that is related to the innovation capabilities that have been identified by David Thies, but and then that others have developed. And so really is to focus who is controlling the main innovation capabilities in digital sector and what are the barriers to entry for those capabilities. And we know what they are. It's data, it's skills, it's risk and patient capital, it's computing power. So the issue is really to look at that. So that's the first thing. The second thing then is, okay, on what kind of behavior you should focus, on what kind of conduct. And here, an important one that has been very well explained by the two authors of Georgios, Marshall Van Alstyne and Jeffrey Parker, is this envelopment strategy, which is a kind of development of the bundling theory of harm that has just been explained before me. And so the idea there is, okay, you you base yourself on your large user base, and because there is so much economies of scope in product development, you can envelop your competitor in another market. And so the author of the seminal paper mentioned the case of Microsoft and Netscape. Microsoft used its operating system to envelop Netscape at the beginning of the century. The other problematic conduct, or where the competition authority should focus their attention on, is when you refuse to grant access to key innovation capabilities. Okay? And it's very much in line to what Georgios presented in his paper. This is all the issue of access to data. No, I agree with Georgios that probably if you want to have an effective system of data access and governance, you need regulation, and I will come back to that in a minute. But you could already, if there is a refusal to give access, or you gave access before and then you stop to give access to data, maybe competition law with the essential facilities doctrine can help. And then the third one is the internal discrimination or self-preferencing when you are players and referee and you favor your own service. I mean, Inge has mentioned that, and I think by extending the price squeeze rationale that has been mentioned also by Rezo, you could probably deal with it. So, I mean, we can do a lot with competition law, but probably not enough. And this is why, and how you would do that by updating the guidance and having more interim measures. But, and that was, I think, the point of Vestager yesterday. She said that probably that's not enough, okay? And so we need a complementary tool, hopefully not substitute tool, but a complementary tool, which would go further than competition law. Now, the first question is, yes, but with which kind of threshold? And probably it should be another threshold than dominance, okay? And in the paper, we propose a threshold based on three elementary criteria. The first is that the market structure should be concentrate and non-contestable. So it's very difficult to enter in that market because there are barriers to entry, in particular on key innovation capabilities. The second element is that the company is really a gatekeeper in the sense that the customer mostly single home or do not really, the multi-homing is not very effective, okay? So that are the two main criteria, and that is an idea that we took from the telecom framework. Now, our point is not to say that we should apply the same thing as the telecom framework in digital, because the world are very different, the issues are very different. But there is an interesting criteria in the telecom law, in the European telecom law, which is to say when competition law is ineffective, and there are some elements in the law, then you have to have something. Okay, so those are the three criteria we propose to trigger this additional instrument. Now, this additional instrument will be there to impose a series of remedies that cannot be imposed effectively by competition law. And again, I am coming back to the paper of Georgios and his co-authors. This is really around data sharing and data access. Now, we see data sharing, so one company giving data to another company as a way to make the market more contestable. And then we see data portability, which is, the customer using its data and porting its data from one platform to another as a way to help switching and multi-homing. So, those are two data issues, but they are a little bit different and with a different objective, okay? Now, the way to impose those remedies, because we know it will be extremely complicated, we are also working on another paper on this data governance issue, and so I will reach out to Georgios after it for that. But it will be extremely complicated to set up a framework for data sharing and data portability. We have examples, as Georgios has mentioned, with open banking and so on. But I mean, it will be clearly complicated. And so we think that we should involve the company, platform in the system. So this is why we are calling a bit like what Jean Tirole mentioned 2 years ago, this idea of participatory, in this case, regulation. Now, finally, in our paper, what we said is we need a complementary tool, but we said it's an option. Either you extend the feature of competition law with having a market investigation, and so we didn't call it a new competition tool, but I mean, that's what the Commission called a new competition tool, or we said you have a soft economic regulation with strengthened coordination between national regulatory authorities. No, this was an option. I understood from the speech of Vestager yesterday that maybe we will have both, and maybe the economic regulation will not be so soft, so we will have to see. But clearly, our point was we need to have something more, but not the full suit either. Okay, so to summarize, we can work on all competition tool and on new tools. All competition tool focus better the attention on the attention of the antitrust authority on market power in the digital economy, which is company controlling ecosystem and the issue of potential competition. Focus in terms of conduct on those enveloping behavior, refusal to give access to key innovation capabilities, and self-preferencing. And on enforcement, you need to expedite the decision. Then that would probably not be enough, and therefore you need new tools, but we have to be careful in designing those new tools, because clearly there is a risk of overshooting nowadays. And so we need new tools that should be based on a specific threshold, which should be different than dominant, and the remedy will be mainly regarding improving market contestability and facilitating customer switching and multi-homing. It will be difficult, so we call for participatory remedy. And in terms of institutional design, we agree with what Vestager said yesterday. Probably it would be difficult to create a new authority, so either it would be DG Comp or it will be what we have now in the member states. Then that should be, the coordination should be improved. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexandre, also for the really very, very concise and convincing presentation of that complex subject. That's really excellent. So I'm also happy because your excellent presentation gives us time for 1 or 2 questions, which is great because I think that the topic deserves it very much. So when you look at the chat, you have a combined question by Toshiaki, and then we are awaiting a question by Konstantinos.
Yes, the suspense,
the
big suspense.
So would you want to tackle Toshiaki's question?
Yes. I can take the one on data. So yes, of course, we have to be careful when we impose access to data, whether being under competition law, essential facilities doctrine, or those new tools. We have to be careful about incentive to invest in data in the term of incentive in collecting data, storing data, and analyzing data, because all of that is very costly. But our point in the paper is to say, yes, that's true, so we have to take that into account, but if you compare data with another good, maybe there are more reasons to share data than another good for 2 reasons. One is because the data is non-rival, so you can share it without losing it, okay? So that is, let's say, in a way, decreasing the incentive cost of sharing, because you still have an incentive to collect it, even if you have to share, because you can still use it yourself, okay? So because data is non-rival, the incentive cost of sharing is lower. And then the other element is data can be used for different services. It's a kind of multi-purpose technology, if you want, you know? And so in a way, the benefit of sharing is higher, okay? So that's not the point that we should share all data for free. No, our point is not to do that. It's a relative point. Our point is, if you apply the same, let's say, trade-off that you have when you force access to a good, if you apply the same trade-off, because of the specific characteristic of data, probably you would share more easily, you should more easily impose data sharing than the sharing of another good.
Okay. Maybe a very so you see we have by Inge, a question by Inge and one by Asimakis. Maybe if you feel in a position to answer either of those in a very brief manner, I would take this as the last question because before we move on to the next sessions.
Yes, so the question of Makis is, as always, very, very clever. So the question is, indeed, there is a risk of, you know, circumvening the
and already you are receiving questions by phone. That you really made an impact there.
No, but we have to be careful of, indeed, not circumvening 102. And this is why we think that the two first criteria should be stricter than the minimum. So that would already, in a way, alleviate that risk, okay? No. The question then Mike is asked is, okay, is it not better to focus on market structure than specific conduct? Possibly, but I think the risk of circumventing 102 with market structure may be the same. I have to think a little bit more because it's a difficult question, but in any case, we think that it should be a kind of super dominance test to trigger those additional tools.
Okay, thank you very much. So really, my thanks to all presentators, speakers of today. That was really most interesting. Especially I found both the empirical work very interesting and the hard work on making the traditional competition law tools square with the new you know, challenges.